All right, we have a large section to look at in terms of our Torah portion today. But before we do that, Ken asked a question, why do we talk about the 10 words? Well, that's how it's referred to in the Scriptures. If you read the Hebrew, it says 10 words. He gave them 10 words. Of course, the term word can mean thing. In Hebrew can be wider than just a word. It can be a phrase. What's the first commandment according to the way we understand it? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's the first word. It's not a commandment. Why do we start with that one? That's where the text starts. What does that mean? It means, and by the way, this was typical of ancient Near Eastern covenants or treaties, the king that was making a treaty with another king or with a group of people would first explain why he had the right to make that. I delivered you, I have conquered you, you belong to me. Therefore, because of that, this is the things you must do. And this is the way the 10 words start out too. Why does God have the right to... no, I shouldn't put it that way. He has the right always to tell us what is right and wrong. But why does He grace us with those things which will cause us to be successful? Because He took us out for Himself. We belong to Him. He redeemed us. So it's typical in Protestant and Catholic. They have a slightly different ordering of the 10 words, 10 commandments. But none of them start with "I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt" as number one. Now, okay, so I think it's appropriate if you look at Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 6, you'll see that this is clearly what heads. This is the first word that He gives, and then the others are all attached to that and therefore become that much more significant because we recognize He has redeemed us. And as He has redeemed us, then there should be a heart change with regard to who He is, right? A heart of gratitude. That leads a nice segue into our Torah portion because now we're on the 3-year cycle. Not everyone is on the 3-year cycle. Many are, I would say the majority are on a 1-year cycle. The 1-year cycle of reading probably got started after the destruction of the temple. And the reason they did that was because they decided it would be good to always have special meetings in the synagogues on Mondays and Thursdays. Why Mondays and Thursdays? In many of the villages and towns of that region of the world, that was market days. Those were market days. So most of the people were coming in from the outlying areas, and it was a perfect time then to have a full service in the synagogue. And so think about it. If you read the Torah, all the way through the Torah, in 3 years, what happens if you read a new section 3 times a week? Once on Shabbat, once on Monday, and once on Thursday. You'd get through it in 1 year. So that's probably how the 1-year cycle got started. We adopted the 3-year cycle primarily because we wanted to spend a little more time talking about each portion, and the portions are therefore smaller than the 1-year cycle. In the 1-year cycle, as we are at Exodus 34 through 36, the middle of Exodus 34 through the end of 36, isn't it interesting, and we took this from lists that were as old as we could, that are available, that they collated the New Covenant passage in Jeremiah with this passage in the Torah. Now, why do you suppose? What was the tie-in? You could see the tie-in with the Apostolic portion that we chose, because Aholiab and Bezalel were what? Filled with the Spirit of God, and when they were filled with the Spirit of God, they were given special ability to build the tabernacle and all of the things that were in the tabernacle. So you think that the spiritual gifts that Paul speaks about in 1 Corinthians 12, does he have a little bit of that in mind? I think so. The building up of the body of the Messiah comes about by the work of the Spirit in each one of us as He gifts us in various ways to minister one to the other. But then the question continues, why would they have chosen the New Covenant passage in Jeremiah to be parallel or collate with the Torah portion? Any ideas? Mike's got his hand up. That's a mic foul. Oh, I mean, that's a MIC, that kind of a mic foul. Yeah. Wait till you get the microphone so everybody can hear you. There you go. Okay.
Could it be because, is it in Hebrew? I wouldn't know if it's in, but our houses, they're talking about 2 houses, building houses there, and it's talking about building all the particulars of the tabernacle?
Well, you're talking about how it starts out, after these days I will make a new covenant with the house of Judah and the house of Israel.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but that's maybe a little far-fetched.
Okay.
Anything else that rings clear between Jeremiah 31 and our portion?
Well, there's always covenant. You can't.
Yeah, there's
go
always
far
covenant,
from
obviously. Yeah.
Covenant
Yeah,
to not.
that's true. Okay, we have another suggestion up here. Jesse's on his way.
Is it because the Spirit is stirring the people to work and give and...
Yeah, and what was it? What was the term that constantly was being used in our Torah portion? What the people that brought their contributions? What did it say about them? That stirred their heart. Everyone whose heart was stirred. And what's the essence of the new covenant? Written on the heart. So we didn't make that connection. I mean, we could have, we should have, but the ancient rabbi said it's a heart change. What happened at Sinai previous to this pericope? The people willingly brought their gold for what purpose? To build an idol. Now, everyone whose heart stirred him brought this gift to Moshe, to Aaron, to the rest, so that they could build this place which was to be a meeting together of God and His people. Right? So that's how all of these portions fit together. And I kind of talk about that in the first paragraph. Our Torah portion reiterates 7 times that the people contributed as their hearts were stirred or as their hearts moved them, corresponding to Jeremiah's promise that the Torah would be written upon the heart in the establishment of the new covenant. Even as the 10 words were written by the finger of God, we should understand this phrase, and He wrote on the tablets of the words of the covenant the 10 commandments to refer to God, because it's clearly stated in the previous portion. So the writing of the Torah upon the heart is likewise the work of the Almighty. Even as God Himself wrote the words, we don't know exactly how He did that, but He certainly can do it any way He wants. Even as He wrote the words upon the tablets, so He writes those words upon our heart. Now remember, in the Semitic way of looking at things, what happens most in your heart? It's not the pumping of blood. Okay, that's not the primary thing that the heart does in a Semitic or a Hebrew way of looking at things. What is it? Thinking. It's where you make your decisions. It's the volitional part of us. And obviously, when we make a decision, it affects many things in our lives, right? Sometimes it's short term, sometimes it's long term. If you have something written upon the heart, what does that mean? Well, it's just like what happened, you see this all the time. Even professionals, they don't necessarily have the whole book memorized. As like when I mentioned some time ago, I was in a little 2-seater, pilot over here and me next to him, and we're coming down into the airport in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And there's this side wind, and this little plane is getting shifted back and forth, and all of a sudden the buzzers go off and everything starts blinking, and he reaches under his seat and get a book. And I'm thinking to myself, what did I put myself into? I'm flying with a guy that thought he was a pilot. He doesn't even know what to do now. He's looking in the book. So he had to go back up and had to go around again, and the tower told him, you're clear now, and so forth and so on. So we made the landing. Everything was safe. We got into the airport, and I said to him, I got to ask you, And I said, I was keeping my stomach inside as much as I could, but that was terrible. And what really bothered me was that you took the book out from underneath your seat. He said, that's what we do. We take the book out, it's required. We have to go step by step. I have it all memorized. I could have done it without the book, but we're supposed to do it with the book because we can't make a mistake at that point. This is first, this is second, this is third, check, 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 hit this, so forth and so on. Okay? That's what we're talking about when God says, I will write the Torah upon your heart. What does that mean? It means when we make a decision, what are we supposed to do? Get the book out. Is this aligned with what God has said? Is this tell me the way I'm supposed to do it? Is there anything specific in the book that can help me make this decision? I better check it out. That's what it means to have the Torah written on the heart. We make our decisions based upon the wisdom and the righteousness that God has given us in His teaching. Now it tells us that Moses remained upon the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. That's usually symbolic of what? Testing, right? You've got 40 years, or you've got the deluge of the flood, 40 days and 40 nights it rains. You've got the wilderness wanderings. You've got the periods of rest during the days of the judges, the taunting of the Philistines with Goliath as their champion, the temptation of Yeshua in the wilderness. These all are 40s. Later on, in Deuteronomy, Moses explains to the people of Israel that he was 2 times upon the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights as he interceded for the people, imploring God that he would not destroy them for their sin. Once again, Moses stands as a foreshadow of the Messiah who would likewise undergo testing and would emerge victorious as the intercessor for his people. Now, what is going on in our portion? This becomes a major motif in the history of study of this portion of Scripture. What happened to his face? Well, when he came down from the mountain, he was not aware that his face was shining. Why? He didn't have a mirror. He left his iPhone somewhere else. Whatever. And why was his face shining? It was shining because he had spoken face to face with the glorious one, with God. The glory of God was shining in the face of Moses. Now this is picked up by Paul big time in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. In fact, when in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul says, for we see the glory of God shining in the face of Yeshua. He has this all in mind. Why? Because Moses was a foreshadow of Yeshua as the intercessor. He speaks with God face to face as a man speaks with his friend. He has this intimate, close relationship with God that no other man had. Doesn't that remind you of what Yeshua says, recorded in Matthew 11? No one knows the Father except the Son, and no one knows the Son except the Father. Actually, he starts out with that one. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and to whomever the Son wills to reveal him. What did Moses do? He came down off the mountain. He had a close, unique relationship speaking with God, and as a result, he came with the glory. Now, what did he do? He put a veil. When Yeshua came, was he veiled? Oh, yes, he was. He lifted the veil once on top of the mountain, right? Even the prophet says, no one will notice him by way of his greatness. He looks like a common man. His glory was veiled. When Moses went in to talk with God, what did he do? Took the veil off. When he came back out, they saw his face shining, and he put the veil on. Why did he put the veil on? That's the question. The Hebrew uses the verb karan. We get our word karen from that, which is the word for horn. And of course, when you have to remember that in the Middle Ages and somewhat earlier, most people didn't read the Hebrew Bible. There were a lot of Jewish people who didn't read the Hebrew Bible. Contrary to what goes on a lot in the Messianic movement, the majority of the people in the first century, the Jewish people, were not fluent in Hebrew. They could probably understand it, get along with it in Aramaic, but more and more has shown time and time again that the first language of most of the people in the first century was Greek, including the Jewish people, which is why, at least in some of in the Mishnah, it gave the right to have a Torah scroll in Greek. They had metarganim, they had translators at the front of the synagogues who would translate so that people could understand when they were reading it in Hebrew. So, when they were reading, oftentimes they were reading Greek, but many of them were reading Latin. They were reading Jerome's Vulgate. Well, when the Vulgate came to this passage and he translated it, he saw it was the word karan, which means a ray of light, and karan can mean a horn. So how did Michelangelo make the statue of Moses? With horns. He got it straight from a bad translation. Okay? It can show you what bad translation can do to really good art.
No, horns are bad.
Horns are bad? A lot of people think that he was trying to make a slur on Moses, but he was trying to be as literal as he could. That isn't what was happening. Moses didn't have horns when he came down from the mountain. His face was shining. It really means rays of light were coming out from his face. It is instructive to note carefully what happened as a result of the shining of Moses' face. At first, Aaron and the rulers were afraid to come near to him. But after Moses calls to them, they return, and he relates to them the commandments he had received while on the mountain. And they didn't seem to be afraid. He spoke with them and said, "This is what God said on the mountain." Then after he had finished speaking with the people, Moses put a veil over his face, but the text does not explain why. Many commentators have suggested that he did so in order to assuage the fear of the people, but this hardly seems reasonable. Apparently, they were not afraid of the brilliance of his face, for after Moses calls to them, they return and listen to his words. Furthermore, the text goes on to explain that whenever Moses would go into the tent of meeting to inquire of God, this is not the Mishkan, this is a tent outside of the circle of the tents. He would remove the veil, and when he emerged from the tent, the people would see that his face was shining. He would thus replace the veil over his face until he entered the tent again to speak with God. Thus, the text before us gives us no clear indication regarding the purpose of the veil. It is this ambiguity that gives rise to Paul's midrash, or using this text as an illustration in 2 Corinthians 3. Now let me read you what I think is another bad translation of 2 Corinthians 3. You can open up your Bibles there too. Get it on your iPhone, your iPad, your whatever. Okay. He's talking about ministers of the new covenant. That sounds interesting, isn't it? He collates this portion with the new covenant. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need as some letters of commendation to you or from you? You are our letter, written in our hearts, known and read by all men, being manifested that you are a letter of the Messiah, carried by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. And such confidence we have through Messiah toward God. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Wait a minute, the letter kills? Is that what Paul wrote? Yes, it is. Then he goes on to talk about Moses as though he has a ministry of death. In verse 6 he says, verse 7, but if the ministry of death in letters engraved on stones came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently on the face of Moses because of the glory of his face, fading as it was, how shall the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. For indeed, what had glory in this case has no glory on account of the glory that surpasses it. For if that which fades away was with glory, much more that which remains in glory. Having therefore such a hope, we use great boldness in our speech, and are not as Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, that the sons of Israel might not look intently at the end of what was fading away. So, sounds like Paul is telling us the reason. Why did Paul put a veil over Why did Moses put a veil over his face? So the people wouldn't see that the glory was fading. That sounds vain. So the way it sounds in Paul is that he went into the tent of meeting and got it charged up every time, came back out, put the veil back on, say, see, I still got it. And it would start to fade. He'd go back in. And brothers and sisters, that's not what this text means. We know from Exodus 24 that the one with whom Moses spoke was none other than the Messiah, who is the physical representation of God and in whom is the radiance of glory. What did it say? What did it say in Exodus 24? Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 elders went up the mountain, and they ate with God, and it says they saw the God of Israel, and underneath his feet was a sea of glass. He has feet? He can be seen? Wait a minute. I thought John said no one can see God at any time.
You're right.
Well, as such, the glory that shone in the face of Moses was, in fact, the glory of Messiah. The writer of the Hebrews tells us in chapter 1, verse 3, that he has the radiance of glory. With that in mind, Paul understands the veil over Moses' face midrashically, or shall we say, as an illustration, as a divine illustration, since Moses can stand as a metonym for the Torah, right? Did we read Moses today? Well, I didn't see him up here. When we say we read Moses, what does it mean? We read the Torah, right? Okay. So when Moses put a veil over his face, what does that mean if we think of Moses as Torah? The Torah is veiled. They can't see the glory there. As long as the veil is on the Torah, they'll never see the glory. Whose glory? Messiah's glory. Well, if we go on and read, it says in this 2 Corinthians 3, having therefore such a hope, we are not as Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, so that the sons of Israel... Now, what does it actually say in the Greek? So that the glory would be rendered ineffective. Their minds were hardened, for until this very day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, by the way, that's the only time in the whole Bible where the term Old Covenant is found, the same veil remains unlifted because it is removed in Messiah. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart, over their mind. But whenever a man turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Now see how he makes a nice midrash on this? But we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. You mean the glory of the Lord is supposed to shine in our faces too? Yeah, why? Because we're supposed to be testimonies for Yeshua. We are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. And he goes on in chapter 4, in the next chapter, to say that we see the glory of God shining in the face of the Messiah. Do you get the picture? Okay, Moses goes up to the mountain. He talks with God, who is Yeshua. He comes down with the glory of the one with whom he spoke. Do you want to speak with Yeshua? Do you speak with Yeshua? Then there ought to be something in our faces that tell people we've been with him. Don't you love that in Acts 4? Comes to my mind. John and Peter. Luke says, they were uneducated, untrained people. But the Pharisees were amazed at their wisdom and their boldness. And then it says, and they took note that they had been with Yeshua. Wow. That's a university we all want to go to, right? Amen. So wait a minute, but you say, Tim, the New American Standard and almost every other Bible you read is going to say that the glory was fading. No. Sorry. Unfortunately, the English translations of 2 Corinthians 3 have been influenced by yet another interpretation, this idea that it was fading. But the word translated fading is katargeo, and the Greek word, and if you trace that word all the way through the Apostolic Scriptures, every time it's used, it never means to fade. It means to render ineffective. In fact, it's used of laws that are set aside because they're no longer applicable. What term would we use if you abolish a law? If you do away with it, nullify it, make it ineffective, it no longer has any teeth. That's what the term means. Now, this is difficult. I admit it. Does God hide His glory from some? Does He have the right to do that? Yes. Even when the disciples came back, you remember in Luke, it's in chapter 9 or 10, 11, around there. And they were praying. Actually, it was Yeshua who was praying to the Father. And he said, and they came back to Yeshua and they said, even the spirits are subject to our name, but there were some that we just had a difficult time with. And he says, Yeshua prays to the Father and says, Father, I thank you that you have hidden these things from the wise and you have revealed them to babes. So you know something? If the Lord enables us to grow in the understanding of the Scriptures, to understand Him, it isn't any platform for pride. Because who does He reveal to? Babes. People that don't have any understanding by themselves. Everything we have is from God. And everything that's from God is a matter of His grace. Now, the Net Bible got it right. And I don't know why exactly, because, well, there were good scholars in the Net Bible. The Net Bible got 2 Corinthians 3 correct. It may be that at the ETS meeting years ago, there was a booth where they were working on the Net Bible, and they said, any of you want to come along and write down your pet peeve translation? And there were numbers of us, because we had a little discussion about this, and we went over to the booth and we said, please don't say fading for katargeo. Please do something else. And they did. And their translation of 2 Corinthians 3:13 says, and not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face to keep the Israelites from staring at the result of the glory that was made ineffective. Now you say, well, that's kind of a twisted sentence. I agree. But so is the Greek. It's a little bit hard to translate. When Paul was asked, at some point he must have, why has a partial hardening fallen out upon Israel? Not a full hardening, partial hardening, right? In every generation there's been a remnant of Jewish people, Israelites, who have truly come to faith in the Messiah. But what did Paul come to the conclusion? Under the superintending work of the Spirit of God, why? Why was there a partial hardening put upon Israel? So that the Gentiles might be brought in. God's purpose from the very beginning, Genesis 12:3. And in you, what? All the nations of the earth shall be blessed. I still have this picture in my mind of God being the Lord of the manor and Israel being His butler. And he hands the butler this silver tray of wonderful, luscious food. And they're supposed to go out into the dining hall and serve all the people that have come in that he's invited from all over the place. And the butler looks at that and says, wow, this is too good to give just to common people. And he sits down in the hallway and starts eating it himself. Think about it. Where did it all start? He says in Acts 1, he says, well, Luke also, but it lived out in Acts 1, remain in Jerusalem until the power from on high comes upon you. And then you shall be witnesses starting where? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and what happened when they went to Jerusalem? Persecuted, kicked out. How about Judea? Kicked out. There were some who believed. How about Samaria? How about Antioch? Oh yeah, people are just hanging on every word. Why didn't God just make everybody accept it? He could do that. When Paul is in asking these questions, he gives a very interesting answer. Does the pot say to the potter, why'd you make me this way? In other words, what kind of an answer is that? It's Paul saying, we don't know why. God doesn't give us why in this case. He has his own plan to bring together a people of every tribe, every language, every culture, every nationality, however you want to say it, and a number of people that's beyond number to his honor and to his glory, and he's going to do it his way. And he's invited us to be part of it. He's invited us to be witnesses. So what do? We look around for people that have something on their forehead saying, give it to me, I'll accept it. Nope. We give it to everyone indiscriminately. Why? Because we plant the seed. Who brings the increase? God does. And he does it through the gospel. Well, that in itself is probably enough of a lesson from this Torah portion. What do we learn from the fact that the people just bring... Now, I got to be honest with you. I've thought of this many, many times. If you're a part of the leadership of a nonprofit organization, and I'm not talking about Beit Hallel, I'm talking about TorahResource Institute. One of the things that you are required to do, you have no choice, except on Shabbat, you check the bank account. You want to know if you can make payroll this month. Right? Any of you that have been businesses, it doesn't have to be nonprofit. Some of us have had our own businesses. You're looking to say, can I pay the bills? What would it be like if you had to draft a letter to send out to everyone saying, please stop sending your money? The bank doesn't have any more room for all the money I'm bringing in. What is that? Isn't that what happened in our Torah portion? What does this illustrate? It illustrates this principle, this biblical principle. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be also. There had been, at least temporarily, it doesn't seem as though it's long term, but at least temporarily, there had been a major change in the people of Israel at this point, right? Everybody had turned from their idol and it said, we understand that the God that speaks with Moses is the true God, and he can do all of his holy will. And they were willing to take their gold, they were willing to take their silver, their bronze, their dyes for their different cloth and so forth, and bring it and just give it for the work of God. Now, I'm not going to take an offering, don't worry, okay?